Welcome to theAnalysis-news. I'm Greg Wilpert. The relatively small Central American country of Nicaragua continues to stir up much debate among progressives around the world, especially following the last presidential election, which was held on November 7th. Incumbent President Daniel Ortega was re-elected to a fourth term that election, along with his wife, Rosario Murillo, as vice president. Critics of the Ortega-Murillo government charged them with undermining the country's democracy for arresting up to 7 individuals who were said to be considering to run for president. Also, over 100 remain arrested following protests in 2018. The Ortega government charged many of them with treason for having received money from political activity from the US government and for not having disclosed their funding sources. Meanwhile, on Ortega's inauguration day in January, the United States government under Biden issued more sanctions against leading government officials. Given this and other developments in Nicaragua, to what extent does it make sense to call the Sandinista government, which in the 1980s was a beacon for the revolutionary left in Latin America, a progressive government? How deep is the US involved in undermining or potentially overthrowing Ortega? And was the November presidential election fair in the first place? These are some of the questions we will be exploring today in a debate between an Ortega critic who once was a supporter of the Sandinistas and who had worked in the Ortega foreign ministry in the 1980s, and a current supporter of the Sandinista government. The critic is William I. Robinson, professor of sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Also, he recently was an editor of the special issue of the Journal on Latin American Perspectives on Nicaragua. On the other side, we have John Perry, who is a longtime writer for Nicaragua for many different news outlets and lives in the town of Masaya, Nicaragua. Thanks, William and John, for joining me today.
Pleasure to be on.
You're very welcome.
So let's start with you, John. As I mentioned in the introduction, there has been a lot of debate on whether Nicaragua should be considered a leftist or progressive government. Since that's a very large question, let's narrow it down a little bit and look more specifically at the extent to which Ortega, who has now been in office since 2007, has ensured or failed to ensure the population's social and political human rights. What's your take on this, John? Let's try to limit this intervention on all of them, actually, to about 3 to 4 minutes, okay?
Well, let's start by saying that the Sandinistas won power, of course, first in 1979, but were very limited in what they could do during the 1980s because of the sanctions from the US, intense sanctions, and the Contra war that was financed by the US. They won elections in 1984, which weren't recognized by the US, and then they lost elections in 1990, which led to 16 years of corrupt neoliberal government in which the country fell back into misery effectively. Hundreds of children weren't going to school. There were high levels of poverty. The health service was in collapse. There were daily power outages. For example, the community where I live had no electricity for over a year. And then Daniel Ortega regained the presidency in 2007. So I just want to say some of the things that have been achieved in those 15 years, bearing in mind that I live in the third poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, yet we've seen a complete transformation, for example, of the health service. The government has built 23 new hospitals, all very modern hospitals. I was in one only a week or two back. This meant that the government dealt with COVID effectively during the pandemic, whereas children had to pay for various aspects of schooling, and there was a high level of absenteeism from school under the neoliberal governments. Now there's free education right up to university level, and school children get a free lunch, which is very important so they're in tackling malnutrition. In fact, there's been a massive reduction in poverty. I know William disputes these figures, but I think the government claims that poverty and extreme poverty have been reduced by a half. I think the evidence is there on the streets. You simply don't see the children without shoes, the children with malnutrition that you used to see 15 years ago. And then we've seen drinking water coverage improve massively from only half the country to nearly all of the country. The same with electricity, and now 70% of electricity is renewable. There have been tremendous advances in the position of women, so that the World Economic Forum said that Nicaragua was 5th in the world in gender equality, having been 90th in 2007. And it's become the safest country in Central America. So during the period of the violent coup attempt in 2018, which no doubt we'll talk about later, of course, things got very bad, but the country has recovered very quickly and it now has the lowest homicide rate in Central America again, and one of the lowest in the whole of Latin America, and the lowest femicide rate in the region. It's been well prepared for disasters, so that's when Hurricanes Eta and Iota hit the country, and it hit Honduras and Guatemala at the end of 2020. Unlike those other countries, there were very few deaths here, and the communities recovered quickly. And there's been a tremendous boost in the recognition of indigenous territories, with all of the indigenous communities now having autonomous systems of government. And I think that's why, essentially, you mentioned the election results, Greg, that's why 66% of Nicaraguans voted in November 2021, and why, whether they were ardent Sandinistas or not, or just simply wanted a stable government and continued economic growth, why 75% of the electorate voted for the present government.
So, William, what's your take then on Nicaragua's fulfillment of social and political rights, and what's your response to John?
Yeah, well, I'm not going to speak about the elections and some of the claims that John made, because I know we're going to come back to that in the latter part of the interview. But Greg, before I start, I want to correct something you said in the introduction. You said that these people have been arrested and be put on trial, and that's what's taking place this very week because they received money from the United States. That's not true. A couple of them have. Actually, Dora Maria Tejas and many others have just been sentenced to 13 years in prison for supposedly, and the actual charge is conspiracy to damage national integrity. And what they were accused of is social media. Their tweets, and their Facebook accounts were, what police intervened in them and presented them as evidence. That was the only evidence for those who have been tried. What the police said, these are tweets and this is Facebook's. And in tweets and Facebooks, what they were doing was criticizing the government. And that is illegal now to criticize the government. It's called a hate crime. It's called a violation of national sovereignty when you criticize the government. But I know we'll come back to that later, but I wanted to correct you on that. Here's the thing, that the international left is genuinely confused about Nicaragua because of the history of Nicaragua, but also because of the rhetoric coming out of the Ortega regime. Ortega has been remarkably adroit in using radical sounding language, anti-imperialist rhetoric, to strike this reflexive chord among supporters in the international left. But we need to be careful not to confuse appearance with essence and rhetoric with reality. We want to look at the actual programmatic content of the Ortega regime. And what we see is there's nothing revolutionary, there's nothing socialist, it's a repressive capitalist regime. Now, I know I only have a few minutes, but I want to take the story back briefly. After the Sandinistas lost power in 1990, a new Sandinista bourgeoisie arose. They arose because they appropriated for themselves public property. The revolution had 60% of the country's property and resources had been made public as part of the 1980s revolution that was appropriated by the inner circle around Ortega, who have now become a new millionaire class. They've joined the ranks of the country's elite. They've joined the ranks of the country's capitalist class. They're heavily invested in tourism and agro-industry, in finance and import-export, in subcontracting for the sweatshops, for the maquiladoras. They now share an affinity of class interests with the traditional bourgeoisie in Nicaragua. Let's remember how Ortega came back to power. In 1998, he signed a pact with the extreme right Constitutional Liberal Party and the person who was president at that time, Arnaldo Alemán, a millionaire businessman himself, but also one of the most corrupt figures in all of Central America. They signed a pact of co-governance, and then Ortega went on to meet with Cardinal Obando Bravo, who at the time was the hierarchy of the Catholic church hierarchy, because he wanted church support, and he promised and then delivered on his promise to pass the most restrictive anti-abortion law in all of Latin America. Even if you're a child who's raped, and even if your life is in danger, you can't have an abortion or you're thrown in jail. And in front of Obando Bravo and the media, he said, I'd like to have a confession and apologize for the sins of the Sandinistas in the 1980s. Then they met on the eve of Ortega returning to power in late 2006, early 2007, Ortega and his representatives met with COSEP. COSEP is the Superior Council of Private Enterprise. That's the big association of big Nicaraguan capitalists. And they said, we're going to give you everything you want is economically, as long as you don't question our monopoly of political power. They signed a pact of co-governance. So until 2018, from 2007 to 2018, Ortega co-governed with the capitalist class. Now, what is the economic program that Ortega has pursued? This is laid out in the 2006 document, what the economic program was going to be, and it has been carried out. First of all, it promised that economic program, when Ortega came back to power, absolute respect for private property, unrestricted freedom for capital, no capital controls, no progressive taxation, attracting transnational corporate investment, promoting free trade, expanding agro-industry, and rolling out, which exactly what's happened, the welcoming mat to transnational capital with 10-year across-the-board tax holiday. Corporate receipts plummeted after Ortega took office. Let me conclude. I know. Let me just make just one other point on this. This is a lot to discuss here. But Ortega is compared to the pink tide. It is a very big mistake to say that Ortega is part of the pink tide in Latin America. Let's remember what Mas did when he came to power, what Rafael Correa did when he came to power in Ecuador, what Chavez did when they came to power. They nationalized resources, and then they heavily taxed transnational corporations. Not only has nothing been nationalized in Nicaragua, 96% of the economy is in the hands of the private capitalist class. And again, tax holidays, they're not even taxed. And remember that Chavez, I'll conclude with this. Remember that Chavez led the Latin America-wide charge against the free trade area of the Americas, that you were in Venezuela at the time, Greg, where that Bush, Bush Senior, Bush Jr. was imposing on Latin America. Chavez led that charge and successfully undermined this free trade area of the Americas agreement. Distinct to that, in 2006, all of the social movements in Central America have mass mobilization against the Central America Free Trade Agreement, which was the local counterpart to the continental one. And Ortega came to power, ignored those social movements, ignored the demands of the mass base in Nicaragua to reject that treaty, and openly embraced the Central American Free Trade Agreement. I mean, I could go on. We have very little time to...
You'll get another chance. You'll get another chance. So let me give John a chance to respond, and I'll have to, in fairness, give you a little bit more time as well. So what do you say to all of that, John?
Well, Greg, nobody's disputing that this isn't a mixed economy. The important thing to emphasize is the tremendous role of small and medium enterprise in the economy. It's over half of national income produced by small businesses, and only 30% from the big businesses that William is talking about. And Nicaragua remains a big rural, having a big rural population. It produces well over 80% of its own food. It's close to food self-sufficiency. It's been a tremendous workshop for cooperativism. So there are well over 5,000 cooperatives employing nearly 500,000 people. And there's a specific ministry in the government, MEFCA, the family ministry, which is unique in Central America, which engages with small businesses right down to individual women running small shops on the side of the road. And it engaged with 1.5 million people last year through its 20 local offices. So yes, it's a mixed economy, but it's a mixed economy which works for ordinary Nicaraguans, which is, I repeat, why they voted for the current government in November's election.
John, sorry, William, there's also, I just want to add just one other thing to what John said also, that recently with regard to the anti-abortion law, I saw that it has never been enforced. So some people who support the government say at least, well, that's not really much of an issue. In addition to the fact that Nicaragua has a huge amount of women participating in all levels of government, much more than any other country in Latin America. So I don't know if you want to address that as well in your response.
Well, I'll say with what you just said, it's never been enforced. That's totally false. Rosa is a 12-year-old girl who was raped by her stepfather, and this is when Ortega had already come back to power, and she had to be smuggled out of the country to Costa Rica to get an abortion. Okay, and then she couldn't return because she was told that the 12-year-old would go to jail. Later on, they were forced to back down. But I want to say, John is saying this is a mixed economy. Well, it's a mixed economy in which 4% of the economy is in the hands of cooperatives or small businesses, but 96% of the economy is in the hands of capital, controls all sectors of the economy. And he mentioned these early improvements. I have, and by the way, I've published several books on Nicaragua and I've published dozens of articles. I recognize these early improvements, but where did they come from? Because the improvements he mentioned are all up until 2014, 2007 to 2014. Three things accounted for those improvements that John mentions. First of all, there was a massive influx of transnational corporate investment. Secondly, all of Latin America, not just Nicaragua, experienced what we call the super commodities boom. Up until 2013, 2014. And so all of this money came into Nicaragua. And it's true that they used some of that to build hospitals and schools. And I applauded that at that time. But the biggest source of income that was used was $4 to $5 billion in a Venezuelan subsidy as part of the ALBA program to Nicaragua. And so that's when we saw these improvements. The economies, and then the Venezuelan funds dry up, and then the super commodities boom is over, and the economy starts to deteriorate in 2015, and the government moves on to implement all of these neoliberal measures prescribed by the IMF. But I'll conclude with this. This is the key thing. John is saying the government claims this reduction in poverty. I've studied this very carefully. And the most reliable source for this, for the reduction in poverty, is FIDEG. FIDEG stands for International Foundation for the Global Economic Challenge. It's a Managua-based and was a government-supported research institute run by Alejandro Martinez Cuenca, who is an Orteguista. He's not in the opposition. And his organization has carried out household poverty surveys every single year since Ortega came back to power, and Ortega used to support these annual surveys. And what they showed is that poverty went down from 2007 to 2014 from 44.8% to 39%. So we're talking about approximately a 5.5% reduction in poverty. Of course, that was positive. And then from 2015, when there's no more Venezuelan subsidy, when commodities prices go down, poverty goes right back up. By 2019, 2020, it's right where it started. You know, I know I'm running out of time. John says that there's no malnutrition. Actually, international agencies tell us malnutrition is on the rise again, and so forth. But again, just have a few minutes to comment here.
Okay, John, let me give you the last word on this particular topic, because you haven't used all of your time yet, unlike William.
Let me just say that FIDEG does receive money from USAID. I don't know anything about it, but FIDEG does receive USAID money. And it's also important to note that the World Bank figures, which William has said are collected by the government. Yes, they are collected by the government, but they're collected under the supervision of the World Bank. And I checked with somebody about this when William made this point before, and he said they do have to have their results ratified by the World Bank before they're published. I think the important thing is really just to emphasize that, yes, it's a mixed economy, but the size of the small and medium part of the economy is almost uniquely big in Latin America. And the government has made these specific efforts to encourage it. And at the same time, run these big social programs that didn't stop into 2014-15. They continued because some of those hospitals that I'm talking about, including the most recent one in Chinandega, have been built last year. And you can see the progress that's being made since the economy began to recover after the pandemic. And really, if you're here, you can see what's happening.
Well, let's move on. And we'll get back actually to some of these issues again in the last topic, but let me ask about the international relations, because that's also been a huge issue given the history of US intervention in Nicaragua. As anyone who's remotely familiar with Nicaragua's history knows, the US has spent billions of dollars, including the blatant violation of international law and of Congress's will, trying to overthrow the Ortega government during the 1980s. And during the Reagan presidency, and to fund an armed insurgency known as the Contras. More recently, though, the U.S. Obviously hasn't been doing that, but it has been spending millions of dollars via the National Endowment for Democracy and the U.S. Agency for International Development, also supporting the opposition, apparently. So, and also the U.S. government has started to introduce sanctions gradually against the Nicaraguan government, or at least government officials. So what effect, if any, would you say have these efforts had on Nicaraguan economy and its politics? So let's start with you this time, William.
Okay, well, I want to say, first of all, that there is a confusion in the international left that there are these sanctions on Nicaragua. And in fact, I want to, even Amy Goodman, right after the elections that were held last November, announced in the broadcast the following day that Nicaragua was experiencing, and I'm quoting her, ongoing and devastating US sanctions. John wrote an article in which he said there's crippling sanctions on Nicaragua. You would never know that that's completely false. There are no US trade or commercial sanctions currently on Nicaragua. The United States is Nicaragua's principal trading partner, and in 2021, trade between the two countries was $6 billion. Nicaragua continues to be a member of the Central American Free Trade Agreement, which gives it preferential access to the US market. The United States has not blocked transnational corporate investment. In fact, in 2021, $700 million was invested by a US-based company in the energy sector to build a gas-powered plant. And the company that did that investment is Fortress Energy, whose owner is Wes Edens, which is a close friend of the US President of Biden and a financer for the Democratic Party. The United States has not blocked flows of international credit to Nicaragua. Just between 2017 and 2021, Nicaragua received over $3 billion in credits from international financial institutions, including the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the Central American Bank for Economic Integration, the International Development Bank. I want to point out that this flourishing trade, this lack of any sanctions, except the only sanctions are on a handful of top Orteguistas, and their sanctions are only sanctions on their bank accounts and private holdings and business enterprises in the United States. And we want to ask, if these are so-called revolutionaries and leftists, why do they have million-dollar bank accounts and enterprises in the United States? Those are the only sanctions. Now, I want to speak about, and I want to say that this is in such radical distinction to Cuba and Venezuela. Cuba and Venezuela face these devastating all-out blockades, including paramilitary aggression. There's no paramilitary aggression against Nicaragua. So people clump together Nicaragua with this devastating attacks against Venezuela and Cuba, and that's totally false. I want to say something, because you mentioned this, about the NED, the National Endowment of Democracy, and AID funding for the opposition. I wrote the first two books exposing the NED around the world, and I condemn anything the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, does around the world. I condemn any US intervention, but we have to put this in context. It's true that there's a $6 million over the last 10 years given to these civic opposition organizations in Nicaragua, some of them. But I have analyzed and I've shown that this funding is not aimed in Nicaragua currently at overthrowing the Sandinista government. It's aimed at countering anti-capitalist radicalization of civil society and not at undermining the Sandinista leadership. And the principal recipients of this NED funding has been COSEP, the capitalist class and its different affiliated organizations that has been co-governing with Nicaragua. With Ortega. The NED provides, moreover, funding to 100 countries around the world, the vast majority of them close US allies. Guatemala and Honduras combined receive more NED funding than does Nicaragua. So obviously, just because a country is receiving NED funding doesn't mean that means that the NED is trying to overthrow the government. Colombia receives millions of dollars, the closest US ally in Latin America, from NED funding. And with regard to the AID, the Agency for International Development, which is the parent organization, the AID has given several $100 million to the Ortega government for import-export support, for the health and educational sector, and for many different programs, development programs. So Ortega's received $200 million since he came to power until 2018 from the Agency for International Development. And I'll just conclude with this, that Ortega has been broadly praised, again, all of this up until 2018, by the International Monetary Fund, by the World Bank, and by the AID for its neoliberal economic policies that we condemn anywhere else in Latin America. When the IMF and the World Bank prescribe neoliberal policies, and if the government is complimented by the World Bank and the IMF, we say, oh, that government's bad. And in Nicaragua, some leftists get confused and saying, well, look, we should support Ortega. Even the IMF and the World Bank like Ortega.
Okay. Well, let me give John a chance to respond, and especially, John, you've also written on this topic. What's your response?
Sure. Well, let's look at what USAID has spent since 2017. They've spent $178 million, and that's gone into funding hostile media, social media attacks, opposition think tanks, training programs for young people. One was offered training to 2,000 Nicaraguans in so-called party political training. The $178 million is $27 per Nicaraguan. If that was spent in the US, it would be $9 billion. It's a huge amount of money in a small economy. One of the most important programs is called RAIN, Responsive Assistance in Nicaragua, which is a specific regime change program that was set up before the elections and is designed to run even if, as happened, the Sandinista government won the elections. And then in the election year, the National Endowment for Democracy had 22 projects, a number of them working with young people. The agencies in the US have commissioned creative associates who's involved in the interference programs in Cuba to work in Nicaragua. And the amount of money going to the opposition, just to give one example, in 2021, the Chamorro family, two of whom are under arrest at the moment, received nearly $4 million, which was then channeled to their own media outlets and other opposition media outlets. In the build-up to the violence in 2018, Kenneth Wallach, who's now the chairman of the National Endowment for Democracy, bragged to the US Congress on June the 14th, 2018, that they trained 8,000 young Nicaraguans to take part in the April uprising. So what did they teach them? Social media methods, presumably. Did they teach them how to organize violent roadblocks that were set up immediately in many cities? The US ambassador has been engaged with all of the opposition leaders and with the business leaders in the run-up to 2018 and since to promote the opposition viewpoint. And clearly before the 2018 violence, that there'd been massive provision from somewhere. We don't know where the money came from, but somebody had ordered thousands of homemade mortar guns and munitions so that the people at the roadblocks in 2018 were armed as soon as the roadblocks were created. And that secret money must have been coming throughout the period of violence in 2018, because money was being brought to the people who were, to the violent thugs really, who were manning the roadblocks. Dora Maria Tejas was seen bringing this money, bringing drugs, bringing food to the roadblocks in Masaya, for example. Who paid for that money? There were sacks of local money being carried around to pay the people running the roadblocks. There was a tsunami of Facebook posts with loads and loads of fake news that convinced many people, including me for a short while, about the fact that the government was killing students. And almost all of the posts were found later to be false. Where did the serious weapons come from? The AK-47s, the carbines that quickly were being used in places like Masaya and in Atepe. Who was paying for the frequent opposition visits to the US? Who was feeding all of the opposition news stories to the international media? So they never reported anything that was favourable to the Ortega government, or indeed never reported the reality of what was happening here in 2018. William is right to say that the sanctions aren't as tough as they are against Cuba or Venezuela, but they're still pretty tough. The US government is picking off individuals within Daniel Ortega's government every now and again, identifying them, sanctioning them, and that means they can no longer sign international contracts or manage bank affairs. It doesn't affect them personally because most of them haven't got accounts in the United States, but they do need to be able to run effectively their ministries. We've seen the indirect effects of sanctions as well. So banks are unwilling to transfer money. It's making it difficult to bring medical supplies into the country, including during the COVID pandemic. And we've seen the relentless media campaigns that aren't quite sanctions, but get close to it. So I was involved in trying to demolish the campaign by PBS NewsHour to portray Nicaraguan meat as conflict beef, as they call it. And then we had the whole panic around COVID, where the local media and then joined by international media were saying that COVID was handled totally disastrously in Nicaragua, which was completely dishonest of them, because everything here went, relatively speaking, very well indeed. We've had the travel advice against traveling to Nicaragua, which continues. Many mainstream airlines are still not serving.
Okay,
Nicaragua.
let me give.
I have to look at the complete picture, not just individual details like William was focusing on.
Okay, well, let me give William another chance to respond, and then we'll get back to you again. So, William, what do you think? I mean, in terms of that, what John is saying.
Well, I think John's entitled to his own opinion, but not his own facts. And so we have some facts, some opinions here which are presented as facts, but we also have some interpretations of his which are simply completely indefensible. So to begin with, and again, I want to reiterate, I condemn anything that NED does anywhere around the world, including in Guatemala, in Honduras, in Colombia, in Brazil, in Peru. Anywhere, but the NED head never went to Congress and said, we've given this money to overthrow the Nicaraguan government. John created those words, which are not in any record anywhere. He also said that the sanctions are pretty tough. Again, and that they affected the government's response to COVID. That's simply false. Again, the sanctions are on these individuals' holdings in the United States. They're private holdings in the United States. They're not on any Nicaraguan enterprises. And we haven't discussed the 2018 uprising, and we don't have enough time to do that. But international human rights organizations carried on the ground detailed investigations in Nicaragua. They interviewed anyone and everyone across the board. They condemned the government for brutal repression, for opening up fire on what started out as peaceful protests. As far as the weapons, these sophisticated weapons, they had homemade weapons. They had literally, some of them had slingshots. Other ones had these homemade rifles, and other ones, they did create their own little mortar weapons. That's street fighting and clashes that take place all over the world. But they have these petty little homemade weapons, whereas the army, the police, and paramilitary squads with all of the sophisticated weaponry of the army, police, and these paramilitaries that were supplied by the army and police unleashed this mass repression. And the international human rights organizations tell us and there were some Sandinistas killed, both Sandinista political supporters and also Sandinista police were killed, but the vast majority of those killed were the students and the popular neighborhood protests. And we know exactly how those protests started. First of all, the students took to the streets totally peacefully because there was this massive fire in a bioreserve on the Atlantic coast, and the government did nothing about it. And the younger generation is very environmentally conscious. That was completely peaceful. And in the midst of those peaceful protests, in which their heads were clobbered by the police and they were chased off the streets, in the midst of that, the government raised, following IMF prescriptions, neoliberal prescriptions, raised the amount that people had to contribute to pensions and lowered the amount that people will receive from pensions. And this is a population already reeling in poverty and unemployment and underemployment. And with that, workers joined the protest, and other people joined the protest, and the women's organizations joined the protest, and the police opened fire. And the first open fire was students that were killed in the Polytechnic, which the government just closed. And then the whole thing escalated. Then there's violence on both sides, but disproportionate violence, because again, you have the army, police, and the paramilitaries on one side, and you have people with some homemade weapons setting up street barricades, which is exactly how the insurrection of 1979 took place. But I want to conclude. I know, again, we always have these time limits, but he said a couple things about COVID. And first of all, the government received an emergency loan of close to $100 million to deal with COVID. So he's trying to say that the sanctions blocked the government's response to COVID. That's false, John. But secondly, more significantly, the government has been accused of underreporting the COVID cases and of having a very negligent response. So 24 medical associations on the eve of the elections, 24 medical associations, talking about and these are not political organizations, the Association of Nicaraguan Oncologists, the Association of Nicaraguan Pediatrists, the Association of Nicaraguan Cardiologists. They all said that we're in the hospitals, we're seeing people dying of COVID, but the government tells us we have to say they're dying from something else. For that crime of saying that we have this COVID problem, 24 medical associations were banned. Their license was revoked. So this gives an idea. I mean, we go into so much more. This is a family dictatorship. This is a government that acts like a dictatorship anywhere else in Latin America. I don't know. I'm out of time. Greg, I'd like to say something else, but I assume I'm out of time.
Yeah, we'll get back to you again. But so first, John, what do you have to say to that?
Well, just on COVID. I mean, William, I'm afraid you're repeating a lot of the lies that were told at the time. But let's just say the Washington-based, Washington State-based Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation says that on their judgment, not the government figures, on their judgment, Nicaragua has the lowest COVID death rate in Central America and a lower death rate than the United States. And let me just tell you that almost 60% of the population are now fully vaccinated, which is only a few percentage points behind the US, and well over 80% have had at least one vaccine dose. But let me go back briefly to the violence, because this is very important. William, you mentioned the protests against the pensions. They started on April the 18th, and there were no deaths on April the 18th. They continued on April the 19th, when the first 3 deaths occurred. Now, those 3 deaths were a police officer, a Sandinista worker who was trying to defend a town hall from being attacked, and somebody who was walking home from work. There were no protesters killed on the first day of those protests. Yes, there were subsequently, but we were then in a period in which 22 police officers were killed and over 900 injured, and many of those had life-changing injuries. I spoke to a police inspector who said that one of his officers had been shot in the genitals and had lost his genitals as a result of the violence in that period. Now, I lived through this violence. So I was in Masaya practically the whole of the period when this violence was taking place. I was able to go to see the town hall the day after it was burnt down. I was in tears looking at the houses of friends of mine that were burnt down, including my own doctor's house. The main secondary school in the centre of Masaya was burnt down twice. All the shops were closed for 3 months. Many of them were looted. The police, who were confined to their barracks from mid-May until mid-June, were attacked every night. And during that period in Masaya, 3 police officers were killed, one of whom was tortured for 24 hours before he was killed. And he was dragged behind a pickup truck before he was actually set on fire at one of the barricades. A friend of mine, 2 friends of mine, who were involved in defending the municipal depot, which was attacked by about 500 people, many of whom had conventional weapons. All of the workers were kidnapped. These 2 were taken away, they were tortured, and both have suffered grave injuries. One lost his arm. It had to be amputated because it was so badly damaged by being hit by rifle butts. And, you know, the people who lived through these violent experiences in cities like Masaya and Hinatepe, parts of Managua, and other cities that were completely taken over by these roadblocks, know that these people did not just have homemade weapons. They had very serious weaponry. And furthermore, the people who were brought in to man the roadblocks, particularly at night time, were well-known violent elements within society, including people being brought in from Honduras or El Salvador, gang members from those countries. So this is why, one of the principal reasons why people rejected the opposition in the elections, or rejected the opposition calls to abstain, and voted massively for the Daniel Ortega government, because they may not necessarily be Sandinista, but they wanted to return to the stability and calm and safety that existed before 2018.
Well, I think this actually what you just said just sets the stage for us to move on to the next topic, and we'll get back to some of the other things. And also, I forgot to mention, I want to give you both also an opportunity later on to add on any things that you feel like were left unsaid. So we'll probably not run out of time to cover everything you'd like to cover. So, just turning to the election now, we've kind of set up both the domestic and the international context. Now, as was mentioned earlier, also Ortega according to the official election results, was reelected with 75% of the vote and a participation of 66%. Now, the big question is, of course, and this is what has been disputed, including by the OAS and the Biden administration, arguing that this was not a fair election or not a legitimate election. Now, since we're going back and forth, let me start with you, John. What would you say? Was this a fair and legitimate election on November 7th?
Yes, indeed, it was, of course. I mean, I'm sure that William will start to talk about the people who were arrested prior to the elections, but none of them were presidential candidates. It's true that one or two of them might have eventually succeeded to be presidential candidates, but they certainly weren't at the time when they were arrested. And frankly, I think even if one or two of them had stood, they had very little chance of being elected. So I think the 2018 violence, I don't want to go back over that, but the fact that that was very fresh in people's memory was very important in the run up to the elections, and everybody was fearful, me included, that there would be renewed violence, and that was what was being planned by the people who were arrested in the middle of last year in the run up to November's election. And I think, frankly, the fact that many of them were put in jail, I mean, it was a reflection of the reception that received in Nicaragua, that there were no protests against them being put in jail. And I've had loads of conversations with taxi drivers and other people about the response to those people being put in jail. And many of them said, we were grateful that they had, because that meant that the period before the elections would be safe. So we had the elections on November the 7th. There's an electorate of 4.4 million, 2.9 million voted, 66%, a reasonably high turnout. Of those, 2.1 million voted for the Sandinista party. There were five other parties taking part in the elections, including two parties that had formed governments during the neoliberal period. The opposition called for abstentions. As you can see from the voting turnout, the abstention was limited. Probably there was some, but it was limited. There was still 66% turnout, and there were only 161,000 invalid votes. People who marked the ballot to say that they weren't going to vote or wrote something anti-government. It was notable, I think, that the support for the Sandinistas was fairly even across the country, except on the Caribbean coast, where it was much higher. And why was it higher? Because of the experience of people there after the hurricanes in November 2020, when the governments leapt in and really offered help to those people. I talked to somebody who'd been to the small town of Hallover, which was hit directly by both hurricanes and had to be rebuilt. And he said he'd been promised by several people in the town that all of them had voted for the government in the elections. All of them had voted, and all of them had voted Sandinista. William will say that there are opinion polls saying that people weren't going to vote in favour of the government, but there have always been for years two sets of opinion polls that give completely opposite results. The Sid Gallup polls, which aren't related to the International Gallup organisation, often they're paid for by the opposition. M&R polls, which have much larger sample sizes and use face-to-face interviews, and ended up giving an accurate prediction of the results on November the 7th. But of course, the international media ignore those M&R polls, even though they're carried out every month. I just wanted to say something about the safeguards against fraud. I've got Nicaraguan citizenship. I voted. When I got to the voting station, there were about 30 people already waiting to vote in a polling station that was only going to have at maximum about 200 voters. It was quite clear that fraud was absolutely impossible. So electoral registration is tied to ID cards. You have to show your ID card. You have to reproduce your signature. You have to have your thumb marked to show that you voted. There'd been a round of pre-election checks the previous July, and 2.8 million voters checked their register in July, which strongly implied they were going to vote in November, and indeed they did vote. And then there were opposition poll watchers in all 13,459 polling stations. The votes are counted at each station, and then they're posted. The results are posted outside each station, so that people can see at the end of the day what the voting was in their area, and they can later see the same results on the Electoral Council website, and those results are still there if you go and have a look. So the whole idea that there were massive abstentions, which is what had been put about in the international press, the idea that the election was a sham, in President Biden's words, is completely wrong. People voted. Whatever they thought about the arrests in the middle of last year, people went out and voted, and 75% of those people voted for the Sandinista government.
Okay. William, I'm sure you'll have a lot to say about this.
Yeah, it's hard to know where to begin. And, John's methodology here seems to be that he tells these personal anecdotes, that he spoke with a taxi driver, that he spoke with someone who voted, combined with the exact repetition of exactly what the government claims. And that's the two things that he's put together here. So he mentions this poll, which was MR Consultants, is an Orteguista polling. It was hired by the Sandinistas. He works very closely with the Sandinistas. The leader of MR Consultants is Raul Obregón, who's a longtime Orteguista and a friend of Daniel Ortega. So that poll showed that Sandinistas were going to win these elections. He says that Sid Gallup, that their poll was financed by the opposition, but it's based in San Jose de Costa Rica, and there's no basis for that claim. The Sid Gallup poll showed that 70% of the electorate did not feel represented by any political organization, and then after the elections reported that there was 80% abstention rate. There were images coming in. I wasn't in the country for the elections themselves, but there's images from all over of empty polling stations and deserted streets. So the thing is, we can't possibly get accurate figures on the election results. The Sandinistas exercise absolute control over the Supreme Electoral Council, absolute control over reporting on the results. Independent observers were banned, and journalists were cowered into not reporting. There's too much to discuss here. You have to know that in the crackdown leading up, and by the way, he says they're not presidential candidates. Well, of course, every time the party started to meet to name them as presidential candidates, they were quickly arrested and thrown in detention and kept there for 8 months incommunicado and without trial. So technically, they were not presidential candidates. They were arrested before they could be. But as part of this crackdown, the regime decreed these series of laws. One is a cybercrime law, and the cybercrime law, you might think that means you can't get into people's bank accounts. What that means is you can't use social media. If anything you say on social media criticizes the government, you're arrested. So many were arrested on the cybercrime law. Another is a hate crime law. You might think that means, you can't be racist, like what we think in the United States, a hate crime law. What that means is that whatever the government deems generates hate and discontent among the population. Okay, so we can go on. This is the context in which the elections were held. And according to Urnas Abiertas, which is also an independent organization, there was an 80% abstention rate, and the government received 19% of the vote. And that coincides also with the Sid Gallup poll. But I want to say something else. People from outside Nicaragua don't understand the atmosphere in the country. You cannot go into the street in Nicaragua and unfurl the Nicaraguan flag, because the opposition has claimed the Nicaraguan flag as the symbol of its resistance. If you're a student, a 22-year-old student, you go into the streets, it's a street somewhere, and open up the flag, you have to do it for about 30 seconds. Police and paramilitary sweep up on you and arrest you. I want to give an example of the extent of this repression. Sergio Ramirez was Ortega's vice president in the 1980s. He's one of the most important novelists and one of the most important literary figures in Latin America. He published in summer of 2021 his new novel, Tongalele no sabía bailar. It's a fictionalized account of the 2018 mass uprising. So as soon as that was published, and when it was published, Sergio Ramirez was abroad in Europe receiving a literary prize. He was told, we've issued a warrant for your arrest, so now he's in exile. And that book cannot enter the country. It's contraband material. All of the books entering the country was confiscated in customs. So I'm trying to, and by the way, Amnesty International released a report on the elections. Excessive use, I'm quoting from it, excessive use of force, extrajudicial executions, control over the media, deployment of pro-government paramilitary squads against protesters, forced disappearance as a strategy of repression. This is Amnesty International. I'll conclude. I know we're always tight on time here, but I want to say something about the Organization of American States because John mentioned it. The Organization of American States met after the elections, and they passed a resolution saying that these elections lacked democratic legitimacy. Now, what you won't be told is that this was a vote of all members of the Organization of American States. There was only one vote of opposition to that resolution, and it was the Nicaraguan government. Even the Venezuelan government voted in favor of that resolution. So all of the Latin American countries, except Nicaragua, voted saying, yes, these were not democratically legitimate elections. So it's not just Biden claiming that whatsoever. This is, again, I just conclude, Venezuelan government, an ally of Nicaragua, voted for this resolution saying these elections lacked democratic legitimacy.
Okay.
William, surely you know that the Venezuelan representative of the OAS is Juan Guaido. It's not Nicolas Maduro's government. They were expelled from the OAS, or they left voluntarily. It's the puppet, the US puppet Juan Guaido, who supposedly represents Venezuela.
Or we can say Bolivia, we can say Mexico, we can say Argentina.
No, the others abstained, William. There were a lot of abstentions. Yes, there were 4 abstentions. A number voted for the US resolution, but a good number abstained. But the point was that the OAS presented its 14-page report on the elections in less than 24 hours after the elections. In other words, they weren't here, they didn't know anything about the elections, and they'd probably written the report before the elections took place. This idea that you can't go into the street with a Nicaraguan flag is just nonsense. People drive around with Nicaraguan flags on their cars. I've often been offered Nicaraguan flags to wave or to buy in the street. And you don't give a picture of the chaos that the opposition were in that run-up period to the election. The Electoral Council extended the deadline to allow more time for parties to get their presidential candidates sorted out. And even at that deadline, the opposition was falling out with itself over who was going to be a presidential candidate. And it was pretty obvious that they couldn't decide between the different contenders. And you say that nobody is there to disprove what was said by Urnas Abiertas, this organization, which nobody knows who they are because they don't publish any details on who they are, who conducted this survey, which was only a tiny proportion of polling stations on polling day, and it was only for part of the polling day. And yet, if you walked around Masaya as I did that day, I walked around and drove around. I visited many polling stations. There were people coming and going to the polling stations all day. Okay, you could have, it was a Sunday afternoon. So on the hottest part of the day, you could have taken photographs at 2 o'clock and shown deserted streets. But 2 hours later, when the sun had gone down, you would have been able to show people going to the polling stations again. And the idea that people didn't vote is just absurd. And no one who was here, including all of those US observers, admittedly friendly observers who were here, nearly 300 people were here taking part in the accompanying the elections, saw the queues at polling stations. They talked to people, they asked them if they were being forced to vote. Many people were told them they were voting for the opposition. If you look at social media in Nicaragua, there's all sorts of interchange about political interchange in which the opposition is critical of the Sandinista government. And you have to ask yourself, where do these laws come from to control social media and control hate crime, as you put it? They come from the tsunami of fake news that was released in April and May 2018, which convinced a lot of people that the police were shooting students. And it included messages about deaths that never took place, Then it went on to persecuting Sandinistas, identifying Sandinistas as Sapos, with information about where the Sapos could be found or that they needed to be tracked down and killed. You know, the Facebook was a relatively new thing in 2018, and it was grossly misused by the opposition, and hence the need for those controlling laws which were approved last year.
Okay, William, I'll give you the last word on this topic, and then we'll go to closing remarks.
Well, again, you know, I don't know where to begin. John's giving his opinions, and I again repeat, he's entitled to his opinions, but not his facts. He's saying that the opposition just published fake news, and that's why they're arrested. About the observers, the observers, there are 300 observers. They were all personally invited by the Ortega regime. They were housed comfortably, and they were shuttled around to the exact polling stations, and any information they got about those elections were simply shown to them by the regime and told to them by the regime. Again, I want to repeat, international observers, independent international observers were barred from going to the country to observe the elections. I want to say something else, you know, here also, beginning, there's too much to cover. This is a nepotistic family dynasty. Let's remember something. The president is Daniel Ortega. His wife, Rosario Murillo, is the vice president. All 8 of their children are presidential advisors, and they run supposedly public enterprises and public media. And in addition to the family's private business empire, they're outdoing Trump. Trump had 3 of his family members, his son-in-law, his daughter, and his son, as advisors in their corruption. This is all 8 family members. There's now 10 members of the family that basically run the country along with this inner circle. I want to also say something about, again, that the United States is trying to overthrow the Nicaraguan government. I want to remind listeners that there's no coercive apparatus inside Nicaragua that, even if the United States wanted to, when we don't have evidence for that, wanted to overthrow the army, the police, and the paramilitaries are all Sandinista Ortega instruments. That's different than Honduras, when we had a coup d'etat, because the military is a pro-US, pro-capitalist, repressive military. So what we would see if the US wanted, because this is the picture being painted by John, if the US wanted to overthrow the Nicaraguan government, there would be trade sanctions, there would be blocking international credits, there would be blocking that transnational corporations can invest in Nicaragua. That's exactly what the US is doing in Venezuela, exactly what it's doing in Iran, exactly what it's doing in Cuba, doing none of that. So where is the picture of the US trying to overthrow the government? He comes up with these examples of kids in the street that do have homemade weapons. They didn't have sophisticated weapons. They didn't have tanks. They didn't have planes. They didn't have helicopters. They didn't have this high caliber weapons, which was unleashed on them by the military and the police. And you know, there's something else also. I was participated here in the uprising after George Floyd was murdered by the police. And what we saw are millions of protesters, proportionally the same amount as you would have seen the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands in Nicaragua in 2018. And some of those protesters were violent. Some of them attacked police. Some of them burnt down buildings. So John is mentioning that. That's true that those things happen, but that doesn't mean that the US was trying to overthrow the Nicaraguan government. It means this is the nature of violence and conflict clashes among political forces. Okay, so you know, by his definition, then the George Floyd protesters were trying to overthrow a leftist US government, if you want to make that parallel.
Okay, we're gonna conclude this with some closing remarks, and I'm sure you'll want to go back and respond to each other, which is fine. I just want to throw out one thing to consider, and because it kind of came up in the conversation, which is that, is it possible, and I'm just throwing this out as a question because it just occurred to me, that there might have been a kind of a significant sea change in terms of Nicaragua's internal and also foreign politics around 2000, and basically in 2018. On the one hand, that this might have been a moment of inflection, perhaps, where on the one hand, maybe the government, the Ortega government, started to become, more, critical and more cracking down against opposition activity in some sort. Of some sort, with, of course, we can debate about whether it was justified or not, and I'm sure you will. And then on the other hand, that the United States had been supporting the Ortega government up until that point, but then started turning against. Again, I'm just throwing this out there as a possibility. I don't know what the answer is to that question, but it seems to be that maybe the sanctions do seem to be ramping up. Is something that I want to consider. So let me start with you, John, responding both to what I just said and also, of course, to William.
What you said is actually quite pertinent, Greg. Before 2018, the government tolerated all of these opposition activities. So it probably knew that NED money was going into opposition organisations, US aid money. It knew about the meetings at the US embassy. It knew about people going to the US to get advice on what to do to get rid of the Ortega government. It probably knew about all of these things and probably had an unrealistic expectation of how it would be able to manage them. What I think it was totally unprepared for was the way that students responded to apparently relatively trivial things, a minor change in pension arrangements that normally wouldn't excite students, but suddenly had hundreds of students on the street. And clearly this was prepared. It was so obvious that it was prepared. And then the tsunami of Facebook posts, that millions and millions of Facebook posts, many of them from bots, often based in the US, I'm told, that came out over the subsequent weeks. The government simply didn't know how to deal with that. Now it's much more astute about handling social media, but at the time it had no idea. So I think we were all taken in by this. I was for a period, and eventually I from my own direct experience, having stones thrown at my car, realised what was really going on, and started to write about it. So one of my first articles was in The Nation in June 2018. I said that the left and the international media are accepting a consensus narrative on Nicaragua without questioning if the events they were reporting were true or if there was another side to the story. Very soon after that, I had to adopt a pseudonym to carry on writing for my own safety because we were threatened with having our house burned down. And this consensus narrative still applies much later. So much of what William has said aligns with reporting, not just in the New York Times, but also in progressive media like Real News, Open Democracy, and so on. And since 2018, Nicaragua has faced a succession of blatantly exaggerated or false news stories about the violence then about COVID, about migration, about Catholic churches being desecrated, about the legislation, about the election, and much more. But shouldn't the left be asking, is this the real picture? What do ordinary Nicaraguans experience and what do they want? Not the small elite who control the opposition media and get quoted in the New York Times, but the majority of ordinary Nicaraguans. And I think they showed in the election what they really want. My perception is that many people were taken in initially by those protests in 2018, hence the demonstrations that took place in April and May 2018. People then, the majority of people then realised how violent they were and that the people that initially they'd supported were going off to the States to talk to right-wingers in the States, Mike Pompeo, Mike Pence and so on, about what to do next. This was reinforced by the violence at the roadblocks that I've already discussed, and public opinion swung against the opposition back in support of the Sandinistas, which is why they voted for the Sandinista front again in the elections in November. And if I would, it was a great pity that William here wasn't here on election night, because I'd have loved to have driven him around Masaya, which was a city badly affected by the violence in 2018, to see the celebrations on the streets of Masaya on the Monday after the election when the results were announced. I've never seen so many people on the streets waving flags and rushing out in front of cars with pictures of Daniel Ortega and all sorts of absurd celebrations that were taking place. It was so obvious that people both were happy with the result and tremendously relieved that the elections had taken place, were now over, and the country could carry on in peace. and the social development programs that have been taking place would continue as they have been continuing since then.
Okay, great. Thank you. William?
No, John keeps on talking about these personal anecdotes that he saw people were happy in the streets, as if that really tells us anything about what's actually going on in Nicaragua. And again, the two big issues which we should be discussing here, which is the Nicaraguan government leftist, and is the US trying to overthrow it? So first of all, Greg, you say, is it possible that sanctions are being ramped up now? That's not my opinion, John's opinion, or your opinion. Either they are being ramped up or they're not being ramped up, and they are not. There's no evidence for that. They're not simply not being ramped up. Now, I want to emphasize, I don't recognize the right for the US to impose sanctions on any country in the world. I don't support US sanctions. I wouldn't support US sanctions on Nicaragua. But the point is, again, if the US is trying to overthrow the Nicaraguan government, it has all the means at its disposal to do so. It can start by slapping trade sanctions on Nicaragua. It can do what it's done to Venezuela, what it's done to Cuba. Now, John says that everyone was happy until 2018, until there was an attempt to coup d'etat in 2018. And once again, the army, police, and paramilitary are all Sandinista instruments. How can kids in the street carry out a coup d'etat? But that's not true what he said. Grievances were building up for years in Nicaragua until they exploded in 2018. The maquiladora workers, that's the sweatshop workers in the free trade zone, went out on strike in 2016. They were demanding higher wages because the lowest wages in Latin America, except for Cuba, are in Nicaragua. And that's Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean data. And so they went out on strike. They were brutally beaten and repressed by the police. Their leaders were thrown in jail because they were demanding higher wages and that they could organize independent trade unions. The canal workers, they're building a dry canal through Nicaragua. Now, that's not something progressive because the 50-year concession to a Hong Kong billionaire company to build this canal displaced tens of thousands of peasants. Those peasants were protesting in the streets and they were beaten by the police and they were cowed. And this was all before 2018. The miners, the mining communities, the country has 60% of the national territory has been turned over to transnational mining corporations with a 10-year tax holiday to mine whatever they want. There's a new gold rush in Nicaragua because Nicaragua is exporting all of this gold in the hands of transnational mining corporations that are not even taxed because they have a 10-year holiday. So when the mine workers and the local communities protested these mining concessions and their low wages, and the communities protested the environmental damage that the mining was doing, they were also beaten and arrested. And all of this before 2018. And I can go on. The women's movement has been brutally repressed. And so all of these grievances were building up, and they exploded with the two events I already mentioned: the burning of the most fragile bio reserve, and the government did nothing about it. And then all of these neoliberal measures were being implemented. Subsidies for electricity and energy were being cut. Social spending was being cut, again, because starting in 2014, the economy starts to deteriorate. And all of these other neoliberal measures were being put into effect. And then the simple trigger was the pensions. When pensions were lowered and the contributions you have to make were raised. But this was a buildup from 2014 for about a 5-year period. And it's at that point when the government moves from being authoritarian and repressive to being an outright dictatorship. Again, passing all of these decrees where it can declare anything it wants to be illegal and treason. Now, I want to say one other thing, because you started, Greg, by saying that the reason these people are in jail is because they're receiving funding from the US. And I was pointing out that's not true. So these sham trials are going on right now. Already 20 people have been tried and sentenced to 13 years in prison. They're tried behind closed door. No journalists are allowed inside. They're not allowed to talk. Half of them were not allowed to even talk to lawyers. The other half could exchange 2 or 3 words as they walked into the prison. And the trials are being held in the prison where they've been held incomunicado and in solitary confinement for the last 8 months. And the ones that are the most being attacked in these trials are as Dora Mariete's legendary guerrilla commander, Hugo Torres, just died died in detention. Hugo Torres, legendary guerrilla commander. Some of these names will be recognized by some of the people listening to this. So the 5 or 6 people that have been most harshly treated in these trials and just sentenced to all of these years in jail, they, not because they received money from the US, but because, for instance, in the case of Dora Maria Tejas, she retweeted, or simply retweeting, I retweet things all the time, articles critical of the government. She retweeted the OAS resolution on Nicaragua. For that, she's accused of treason against Nicaragua, which really means if you go against Ortega, you're a treason to Nicaragua. But he's singling them out because these are their former comrades in arms that cannot ever be accused of not being revolutionaries themselves, who gave their whole life to the cause of Nicaraguan liberation. I'm talking about people that I worked with in the 1980s, high-level officials in the presidency and in the foreign ministry. So,
okay.
you know, I'll have to end it there, but allow me 30 seconds. I just wanted, as my concluding statement. In Nicaragua, I don't support the right-wing opposition, but the right-wing opposition is the one that was cozy and worked co-governed with Ortega until 2018. The tragedy here is that the repression was most fiercely unleashed on the social movements of women, of students, of campesinos, of workers, of environmentalists. And so that opposition was decimated, which has paved the way for the right-wing traditional oligarchy to achieve hegemony over the opposition. So the mass of Nicaraguans have no left alternative. They're caught between the rock of a Ortega Murillo repressive family dictatorship and right-wing hegemony over anti-Sandinista opposition. So that's the tragedy right now in Nicaragua.
Okay. Well, in fairness to John, I ought to give him another minute or two because you went significantly over. So do you have one last thing to say before we close, John?
Let me try and quickly deal with some of those things. First, the fire in India Mais. It was a relatively small fire, and it was in a very remote place where it was very, very difficult for anybody to put it out, but it did eventually get put out a few days later. William mentioned the protests against the canal and how they were repressed. There were 81 protests against the canal by that particular organisation that keeps on saying that it wasn't allowed to protest. It was allowed to protest, and the canal isn't anyway, in any case, going ahead at the moment. William mentioned the maquilas, the clothing factories. It was workers from a clothing factory near to where I live that came out to defend their factory when it was being attacked by violent opposition thugs in May 2018. They didn't want the factory closed down. They came out and started beating up the thugs that were trying to burn down the factory. We don't know yet whether the US will impose trade sanctions, but it's interesting that Biden signed the Renaissance Act, paving the way for sanctions, only I think it was the day before the November the 7th elections. And finally, this point about the opposition being left-wing. First of all, Hugo Torres. Let me just say, Hugo Torres, yes, sadly died, but he died in hospital. He'd been in hospital with cancer for over a month. His family were able to be with him. Yes, he'd been in detention, but he was taken into hospital with cancer, and that's how he sadly died. But let's be clear that the people like Dora Maria Tejas and the rest of the opposition are not left-wing and haven't been left-wing for years. Dora Maria Tejas supported Eduardo Montealegre in one of the early elections, and Eduardo Montealegre is firmly on the neoliberal side. And in fact, the opposition during that period when they might have gained some currency in Nicaragua in early 2018, they never put forward a left-wing program. The only program they put forward was that they wanted to restore democracy and get rid of Daniel Ortega. And even now, nobody knows what they would have wanted to put in place. And the guess is, of course, that we would be a country now like Honduras, which is a narco state which has had 11 years of neoliberal government. And people don't want to return to the neoliberal government that they experienced from 1992 to 2007. And that is why we had that overwhelming vote in favor of the existing government in November last year.
Okay, well, I'm sorry. I know we could continue a lot longer. This is a very complex topic, and it's very difficult to get at the facts, I think, but I think it's very important to have this discussion and to figure out what's really happening. But I thank you so much for agreeing to participate in this, and I hope we can continue at some point, because certainly the issue will not go away. So once again, thanks so much for participating and for having joined me, William and John.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you to our audience for joining theAnalysis.news. Please don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and to our YouTube channel, and also visit our website and leave a donation. Thanks again.